Movies mirror society. They are the mirrors of the mirror stage, a concept that was created by the psychoanalytic theorist Jacques Lacan. The theory asserts that infants can recognize themselves in a mirror or other symbolic contraptions. They can understand that they are separate from other beings and objects, which creates a desire for what is separate from the viewer. So if movies are a reflection of society and its desires, then what does a horror movie reflect? Horror movies lure the audience with fantasy, but it reflects the fears of society, of the audience. The trappings of fantasy make these uncomfortable and difficult topics palatable, as well as commanding enjoyment from the audience in the fear and anxiety inducing media. In our capitalist society, money becomes more important than one's self-interest. Greed rules everything. What can you do for me? Society demands enjoyment, but it must adhere to the prohibition, the social laws and barriers against certain actions and behaviors. Society ultimately demands sacrifice from the individual, sacrificing enjoyment for the greater good, going to school, going to work, being a parent, doing what you're supposed to be doing. The barrier makes things relative. The sacrifice leads to the desire of what they cannot have. Movies alleviate the sense of lack without endangering the social structure. It allows the individual to visualize the missing enjoyment. Which brings me back to horror movies and what they reflect about society and what they do for society. To really explain this, I will quote the infamous, notorious Stephen King in his explanation of why people like horror films. Horror films intend to take away the shades of gray. It urges us to put away our more civilized and adult penchant for analysis and to become children again, seeing things in pure blacks and whites. It may be that horror movies provide psychic relief on this level because this invitation to lapse into simplicity, irrationality, and even outright madness is extended so rarely. We are told we may allow our emotions a free rein, or no rein at all. Humans are fascinated by what scares them, or what is forbidden. Danger, true crime, murder, the great unknown after death, their own sins, and the corruption of society, and the feeling of hopelessness. That's not to say that everyone wants to become an axe-murderer in their childish subconscious. However, without the prohibition, the social laws and barriers, society would be a lot less civil than it is. The horror genre allows society to work out the differences between us and them. We define ourselves, our identities, by defining the other, the monster in the story. I know who I am because I am not that. Horror movies are a commentary on social issues, albeit these issues are over-exaggerated and twisted into a feature film for viewer enjoyment. The theories found in End of Dissatisfaction and Looking Awry conceptualizes the enjoyment of horror movies. However, it is interesting to acknowledge that despite our society's domination by capitalism and the desire for enjoyment, there are many horror movies that capitalize on being a critique of capitalism. Consider the movie Dawn of the Dead. It's not just a movie about zombies and glorification of bloodshed and cannibalism. It is a critique on consumerism and capitalism and the power it has over society to make us into mindless zombies, hell-bent on buying the newest gadgets and products that we don't really need. The movie is a little on the nose considering the survivors hole up inside a mall, the crowning jewel of modern society consumerism within the United States. Another example of a horror movie as a critique on capitalism and the social elite in general is the 1988 movie They Live. It is about a wanderer who picks up a pair of sunglasses capable of showing the world the way it truly is. He notices that the media and the government are comprised of subliminal messages. meant to keep the population subdued, while the social elite are actually skull-faced aliens bent on world domination. This is a little funny, to be completely honest, because it is the media, Hollywood, making fun of itself. Last week's readings also discussed the power of names and symbolism, which has an interesting connection to horror movies that are hinged on the concept of the demon or the monster being destroyed by the power of their name. Consider The Conjuring. The main protagonist, Lorraine Warren, gains power over the demon and ultimately destroys it when she learns his name, Valak. Now consider the other social issues that plague our society, many of which are not new, but as old as time. Racism, sexism, corruption in the government, murder, religion, the fear of death, classism, poverty, immigration, fear itself, and contagions. The movie The Purge is a criticism on the classism within the United States and the massive divide between the poor middle classes and the one percenters. In one particular analysis of the movie, the Marxism theory, a socioeconomic analysis that uses a materialist interpretation of historical development to understand class relations and social conflict, was utilized as a reference point to analyze the classism within The Purge. The researcher found that there are two forms of oppression within the movie. The first is the ideological Marxist, which consists of racism, materialism, and radicalism, and the second form of oppression is the economic Marxist. In the article, Horror Movies Reflect Cultural Fears, in 2016, Americans Feared Invasion, the author asserts that every home invasion-based horror film was done in an attempt to highlight our country's fear of foreign immigration. In the movie Get Out, it simultaneously engages and subverts the horror film tropes that depict Black lives as disposable in a post-racial America. The sunken place is a metaphor for social death, which is depicted as a void where Black people are constricted and isolated, while a white person controls his or her body and ultimate fate. The movie establishes itself as a criticism for racism and the associated stereotypes that are inherent with the prejudice against Black people, while simultaneously calling out liberal white Americans who were complacent when they believed that racism had been demolished when Obama became president. It is a unique take on the objectification of Black bodies and the appropriation of Black culture. As stated in the preview presentation last week, Contagion is a 2011 movie that is closely related to what is currently going on right now with COVID-19. It is a fictional depiction of how society actually reacts to a global pandemic, with looting, rioting, and violence. The social structure starts to break down, and conspiracy theories run rampant, while the CDC and other health organizations struggle to contain a novel contagion that is easily passable by respiratory droplets and fomites. Fear is subjective, and the unique thing about the horror movie genre is that the majority of the films are able to create a sense of fear that is recognized as universal and true, even across cultures and time. According to Kendall Phillips in his book Projected Fears, classic horror movies like Dracula and Psycho did not cause American culture to go into one particular direction or another. On the contrary, these films were connected to American culture and depicted in such a way that could be recognized as true. Not necessarily that the audience would start believing in The Walking Dead and ghosts, but they would understand subconsciously that what was depicted was accurate to their own cultural fears and concerns. His book goes on to explain how horror films utilize the recognizable and the shocking. According to James Urasini, horror is based on recognizing in the unfamiliar something familiar, or in other words, the resonant violation. Phillips hypothesizes that the projection of cultural collective anxieties, even done indirectly upon the screen, are a vital piece to the politics of the day, forcing the audience to confront these anxieties and think differently about them. They help us cope with the issues of today. The general public's obsession and fascination with horror movies can also be explained by physiological science. Viewers will experience anxiety and stress, which will lead to increased heart rate and sweating. On a neurological level, during scary movies, there is an increased level of activity in the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that deals with emotions, in this case fear. Under extreme circumstances, horror movies can cause PTSD and make the viewer desensitized to traumatic events. So, why do people continually go back to these movies? According to the excitation transfer process and the gender socialization theory, it depends on how it makes us feel, both emotionally and physically. Horror movies specialize in making the audience enjoy the consumption of the perverted, the hidden fears, and the desires that society forces us to hide, allowing the public to strip away its shiny, civilized, mundane wrappings to enjoy, only for a time, the primitive.